Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Saul Wilkerson had calloused hands that told stories of 30 years crawling through basements, fixing what others couldn't, and building something from nothing. At 52, he still carried the broad shoulders of the Marine he'd once been, though the desert tan had long faded to the pale complexion of a man who spent his days in cramped spaces beneath other people's homes. His own home sat on Maple Street, a modest two-story colonial he'd bought with his discharge money and renovated room by room. Every pipe, every wire, every board had been placed by his hands. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was his. Or so he'd thought. Jill had been different when they'd met 23 years ago. She'd been a waitress at Murphy's Diner, working double shifts to pay for nursing school. Saul had been immediately drawn to her determination, the way she'd wiped down tables with the same precision he applied to fitting pipes. She'd seemed impressed by his quiet competence, the way he could fix anything that broke. Their daughter Melissa had arrived 2 years after the wedding, a bright-eyed girl who used to follow Saul around the house, handing him tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. She'd been Daddy's little helper until middle school, when suddenly his rough hands and blue-collar work became sources of embarrassment rather than wonder. Jill had changed too, gradually. The nursing degree led to a job at the county hospital, which led to new friends, new ambitions, and new standards. She'd started making comments about upgrading their life, about wanting more than what a plumber could provide. Saul had worked longer hours, taken on bigger jobs, but it never seemed enough. The signs had been there for months. Late nights at the hospital. New clothes she claimed were on sale. A sudden interest in her appearance that went beyond professional necessity. Phone calls that ended abruptly when Saul entered the room. He'd noticed, cataloged each detail with the same methodical attention he applied to diagnosing a complex plumbing problem. But unlike pipes, he'd hoped this was something that would fix itself. Today was his 52nd birthday. Melissa was having friends over for what Jill had called a small celebration. Saul had come home early, showered off the grime from a particularly difficult job replacing century-old pipes in a downtown brownstone, and put on his best shirt, a blue button-down that Melissa had given him for Father's Day 3 years ago. He could hear teenage voices in the living room as he came downstairs, the kind of animated chatter that usually died when parents appeared. Saul paused at the bottom of the stairs, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own home. Chapter 2. The Crack. The living room fell silent as Saul entered. 5 teenage girls sat arranged on his furniture like judges in a courtroom, their expressions ranging from polite indifference to barely concealed disdain. Melissa sat in the center, her face flushed with what Saul initially mistook for excitement. "Hey, sweetheart," Saul said, managing a smile. "Thanks for having everyone over for." "You're embarrassing me." Melissa cut him off, her voice sharp with teenage cruelty. The words hit Saul like a physical blow, but worse was coming. "You fix toilets. You think that makes you a man? Mom's new boyfriend owns 3 hotels." The room seemed to tilt. Saul's hearing went momentarily fuzzy, as if he were underwater. New boyfriend. The words echoed in his skull while the teenage girls watched with the fascination of spectators at a car crash. Jill's laugh came from the kitchen doorway, bright and musical and utterly without warmth. She appeared carrying a birthday cake that suddenly seemed like a prop in a very cruel play. "Well, it's time you know the truth," she said, setting the cake down with deliberate precision. "You were always just our piggy bank." Saul stood frozen, his blue button-down suddenly feeling like a costume he'd outgrown. Around him, the room he'd painted, the furniture he'd assembled, the life he'd built seemed to shimmer and dissolve like a mirage. The teenage girls were silent now, perhaps finally understanding they'd witnessed something more brutal than they'd bargained for. Jill's smile was radiant, the same smile she'd worn on their wedding day. "Charles has been showing me what it's like to be with a real man. Someone who doesn't come home covered in other people's filth." "Charles." Saul filed the name away with the same precision he'd once used to memorize the layout of complex pipe systems. He looked at his daughter, this girl he'd raised, whose bicycle he'd repaired countless times, whose scraped knees he'd bandaged, whose nightmares he'd chased away. She couldn't meet his eyes. How long? His voice came out steady, which surprised him. Does it matter? Jill shrugged. Charles says I should have left you years ago. I was just comfortable, I guess. The steady paycheck. The reliable husband who never asked questions. One of the teenage girls, a blonde with too much makeup, whispered something to another girl, and they both giggled. The sound was like glass breaking. Saul realized he was still holding his work boots, still smelling faintly of the pipe cement he'd used that morning. In this moment, in this room that no longer felt like home, he was exactly what they saw, a middle-aged man who crawled through basements for a living. But as Saul looked at the cake, at the candles that remained unlit, at the faces surrounding him that ranged from cruel to pitying, something cold and familiar settled in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had in Fallujah when his unit had walked into an ambush, the moment when shock crystallized into something much more dangerous. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked upstairs, leaving his work boots at the bottom of the steps like evidence of a life he was already beginning to shed. Chapter 3. The Departure. Saul's hands moved with mechanical precision as he packed, folding his clothes into neat squares and placing them in the same duffel bag he'd carried as a Marine. 23 years of marriage, and everything that truly belonged to him fit into 2 bags. The rest, the furniture, the decorations, the accumulated debris of a shared life, had never really been his anyway. From downstairs came the sound of renewed conversation, the party resuming as if he'd never existed. Jill's laughter rang out periodically, bright and carefree. Saul wondered if she'd practiced that laugh, if she'd been holding it back for months or years. He moved through the master bedroom like a ghost, taking only what was undeniably his. In the back of the closet, behind winter coats Jill had bought him, he found his old Marine footlocker. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his K-bar knife, his service pistol, and a small leather notebook filled with names, numbers, and details from a life he'd left behind. Saul had never mentioned his specialized training to Jill, never talked about the 18 months he'd spent with force reconnaissance, or the skills that went far beyond basic infantry. Some skills never rusted. The phone started ringing as he zipped the second bag. Saul ignored it, but the sound seemed to cut through the teenage chatter downstairs. He heard Jill's voice, sharp with annoyance, then footsteps on the stairs. Saul. Jill appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from irritation to uncertainty. What are you doing? Leaving? You can't just... we need to talk about this. About how we're going to handle things. The house, Melissa's college fund, handle things. Saul's voice remained steady, conversational. Like you handled things with Charles? Jill's face flushed. That's different. Look, marriage is in, Saul. People grow apart. It doesn't have to be ugly. No, Saul agreed, shouldering his bags. It doesn't have to be. Something in his tone made Jill step back. For just a moment, she seemed to see something in his face that reminded her that this quiet, steady man had once carried a rifle through some very dark places. Where will you go? I'll figure it out. The phone had stopped ringing, but now it started again. Jill glanced toward the sound, distracted. Charles is supposed to come over later. To meet Melissa properly. Maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight. I won't be back tonight. Or any other night. Saul walked past her, down the stairs he'd carpeted himself, past the living room where 6 pairs of eyes watched him with varying degrees of interest. Melissa's face was pale now, as if the reality of what had happened was finally sinking in. Dad! Her voice was small, uncertain. Saul paused at the front door, his hand on a knob he'd replaced just last month when the old one had started sticking. He looked back at his daughter, this girl who'd shared his blood, but not his heart when it mattered most. Happy birthday to me, he said quietly, and walked out into the afternoon sun. The phone was ringing again as he loaded his bags into his work truck. Through the front window, he could see Jill frantically gesturing as she spoke into the handset. 29 missed calls, someone would later say. 29 attempts to reach the man who'd just walked away from everything he'd built. But Saul Wilkerson was already gone, and the man who drove away in that battered pickup truck was someone Jill had never really known at all. Chapter 4. The Reconnaissance. The Riverside Motel sat on the wrong side of town, the kind of place where truckers caught a few hours of sleep and people paid by the week when they'd run out of better options. Saul had chosen it deliberately, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he needed to think, and the Spartan room with its thin walls and traffic noise felt more honest than anywhere else. He'd been there 3 days when his phone finally rang with a number he recognized. Gunny. Christ, Wilk, I've been trying to reach you for a week. You fall off the planet, or something. Master Gunnery Sergeant Albert Moran had been Saul's squad leader in recon, a hard-edged career Marine who'd retired to a small security consulting firm in Virginia. They'd stayed in touch sporadically over the years, the kind of friendship forged in impossible places that distance couldn't really break. Had some domestic issues. Needed to sort things out. Yeah? Well, sorting's good. Listen, I got a situation here might interest you. Remember Dick Dorsey? Saul remembered. Dorsey had been their communications specialist, a quiet genius with electronics who'd saved their asses more times than Saul could count. After the Corps, he'd gone into private security, the kind of work that existed in the shadows between legal and necessary. Dick's been tracking something for me, Albert continued. Charles McCarty. Name ring a bell. Saul's grip tightened on the phone. Should it? Hotel owner out your way. Real estate developer. Also happens to be a complete piece of shit who's been running a little side business trafficking girls through his properties. Eastern Europeans, mostly. Kids who don't speak the language and don't know their rights. The motel room suddenly felt smaller. How do you know about McCarty? Dick's been building a case for a client. A woman whose sister disappeared into one of McCarty's operations. Problem is McCarty smart. Uses cutouts. Keeps his hands clean. The kind of bastard who's bulletproof unless someone gets close enough to see how the machine really works. Saul said nothing, but his mind was already working, cataloging possibilities. Funny thing, though, Albert continued. Dick's been monitoring McCarty's communications. Seems he's got himself a new girlfriend. Married woman named Jill Wilkerson. You know her. We've met. Thought you might have. Small world. Anyway, reason I'm calling is Dick thinks McCarty might be getting sloppy. Love makes fools of us all, right? Might be an opportunity to get someone inside, close enough to document what he's really doing. Saul stared at the water stain on the motel ceiling, thinking about Jill's radiant smile, about the way she'd said Charles was a real man. What kind of opportunity? The kind that requires someone with your particular skill set. Someone who knows how to get into places he shouldn't be and disappear without a trace. Someone who understands that sometimes the law isn't enough. I'm listening. Dick's got everything set up, surveillance, electronic countermeasures, documentation. But he needs someone on the ground, someone who can get close to McCarty's operation without raising suspicions. Someone who has a reason to be sniffing around. Saul understood. A plumber had access to buildings, to basements and service areas where secrets might be hidden. A plumber who was asking questions about his wife's new boyfriend would seem motivated by jealousy rather than justice. What's the timeline? McCarty's planning something big. Dick intercepted communications about a new shipment arriving next week. If we're going to move, it has to be soon. Saul closed his eyes, seeing Jill's face, hearing Melissa's cruel words. Then he thought about other girls, other daughters, disappearing into Charles McCarty's shadow world. I'll need equipment. Already on its way. And Wilk, this isn't just about justice anymore. Word is McCarty's been bragging about his new woman, about how easy it was to take her from some loser husband. Seems he likes collecting trophies. The water stain on the ceiling looked like a map of somewhere Saul had never been, somewhere he might never return from. But as he thought about Charles McCarty, hotel owner, trafficker, collector of trophies, Saul Wilkerson began to disappear entirely, replaced by something much more dangerous. Chapter 5. The Infrastructure. Dick Dorsey hadn't changed much in 15 years. Still thin as a rail, still wearing clothes that looked like they'd been purchased from a government catalog, still carrying enough electronic equipment to run a small surveillance operation. Which, Saul reflected as he watched Dick unpack a dozen devices in the motel room, was exactly what this was. McCarty's got 3 properties, Dick said, spreading photographs across the cigarette-burn desk. The main hotel downtown, that's the Crown Plaza. legitimate business, mostly. Clean books, good reviews, the whole 9 yards. Then there's the Ambassador, about 10 miles out on Route 9. Supposedly a budget business hotel, but occupancy records don't match the parking lot activity. And finally, there's this. The third photograph showed a converted warehouse on the industrial side of town, the kind of building that had been abandoned when manufacturing moved overseas and repurposed for God knew what. Building permits say it's storage for hotel supplies, Dick continued. But the electrical usage suggests something a lot more intensive. Climate control, soundproofing, security systems that would make Fort Knox jealous. Saul studied the images, his trained eye picking out details, multiple exit routes, sight lines, potential approach vectors. Security personnel? 2 shifts for men each. All ex-military, all carrying professional-grade equipment, encrypted communications. McCarty doesn't hire amateurs. Cameras? Everywhere. But here's the interesting part. Dick pulled out a tablet, showing a building schematic. The whole system runs through a central server in the basement of the Crowne Plaza. And guess what's directly above that server room? Saul smiled for the first time in days. The main water line. Bingo. City records show repeated problems with the building's plumbing. Something about corroded pipes, causing pressure issues. The kind of problem that would require an experienced plumber to crawl around in the basement and figure out what's wrong. And how does an experienced plumber get called in for a job like that? Dick's grin was predatory. Funny thing about plumbing problems. Sometimes they just happen, especially when someone who knows exactly which pipes to hit with exactly the right amount of pressure decides to create a little controlled damage. Saul nodded, understanding. It was elegant, really. A few strategic strikes to create a problem that only he could solve, giving him legitimate access to the building's most sensitive areas. What about McCarty himself? That's where your wife comes in handy, Dick said, and there was no sympathy in his voice for Saul's situation. She's been spending a lot of time at the Crowne Plaza. Lunch dates, dinner dates, overnight stays when McCarty tells her husband she's working late at the hospital. She's become a regular fixture. Dick pulled out another photograph, this one showing Jill emerging from the hotel's main entrance on McCarty's arm. She was wearing a dress Saul had never seen, laughing at something McCarty had whispered in her ear. The man beside her was tall, silver-haired, the kind of polished confidence that came from money and power. He's proud of her, Dick continued. Shows her off like a prize. Takes her to the restaurant, the bar, introduces her to his business associates. She's become part of his routine. Meaning, when the plumbing emergency happens, she'll be there. And when the plumber shows up to fix it, McCarty will see exactly what he expects to see. A working-class husband checking up on his cheating wife. Jealous, maybe. Angry, probably. But not a threat. Saul studied the photograph of Charles McCarty, memorizing the face, the posture, the expensive suit. Everything about the man screamed success, power, the kind of confidence that came from never having to answer for his actions. He has no idea what's coming, does he? None at all. As far as McCarty knows, you're just another suburban husband who got traded in for a better model. He's already forgotten you exist. Dick began packing up the equipment, but he paused at the door. Wilk, this isn't just about shutting down his operation. Your wife, your daughter, they chose this. They chose him. When this is over, there won't be any going back. Saul nodded, thinking about birthday cake and teenage laughter and the sound of his work boots hitting the floor. I know. Good. Because Charles McCarty is about to learn that some men aren't as forgettable as they look. Chapter 6. The Pressure Test. The Crowne Plaza's basement smelled like every basement Saul had ever worked in. Damp concrete, old metal, and the faint chemical tang of cleaning supplies. The building's maintenance supervisor, a tired-looking man named Glenn Beach, led him through a maze of pipes and electrical conduits toward the source of their mysterious pressure problem. Started 3 days ago, Glenn explained, his flashlight beam dancing across the ceiling pipes. Pressure drops throughout the building, but only on the 3rd and 4th floors. Can't figure out what's causing it. Saul made appropriate noises of professional interest while cataloging every detail. Camera positions, cable runs, the location of the server room Dick had described. The building's infrastructure was more complex than most hotels, with redundant systems that suggested someone valued security over efficiency. "You done work for Mr. McCarty before?" Glenn asked as they reached the problem area. "First time. Usually work residential." Saul played his role perfectly. The small-time plumber grateful for a high-profile job, maybe hoping to impress the hotel owner enough to become a regular contractor. The damaged pipe was exactly where Saul had left it 3 nights ago, after his careful reconnaissance had identified the perfect spot to create a slow leak that would gradually reduce pressure without causing immediate flooding. It was the kind of subtle sabotage that looked like normal wear and tear to anyone who didn't know better. "There's your problem," Saul said, pointing to the hairline crack he'd carefully created. "Copper corrosion. See how the metal's turned green around the joint? That'll spread if you don't fix it soon." Glenn nodded sagely, as if he understood anything about plumbing beyond calling someone when it broke. "How long to fix it?" "Couple hours. Maybe 3 if I run into complications. I'll need to shut off the water to this section, drain the lines, cut out the bad pipe, and solder in a replacement. Whatever it takes. Mr. McCarty's got important guests staying on the 4th floor this week. Can't have them dealing with low water pressure." Important guests. Saul filed that information away as Glenn led him back to the main mechanical room. The server room was 20 feet away, behind a steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and protected by both a keycard reader and a numeripad. "I'll be upstairs if you need anything," Glenn said. "Try to keep the noise down. Hotel's pretty busy today." Alone in the basement, Saul began his work with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most sought-after plumbers in the county. But his real attention was focused on the patterns of movement above his head. Footsteps, voices, the subtle vibrations that told him where people were and what they were doing. At 11:30, he heard familiar laughter echoing through the building's ventilation system. Jill's voice, bright and animated, coming from what the building directory had indicated was the hotel's restaurant. Saul paused in his work, listening to his wife flirt with a man who was destroying other women's lives. By noon, he'd gained access to the server room. The keycard reader had been surprisingly easy to bypass. A simple matter of tracing the electrical circuit and providing the right voltage at the right connection points. The numeric pad had taken longer, but Dick's electronic surveillance had already provided the code sequence. The servers hummed quietly in their climate-controlled environment, processing data and storing secrets. Saul worked quickly, installing Dick's monitoring devices and creating backdoor access points that would allow them to observe McCarty's entire operation without detection. "Excuse me." Saul spun around to find a young woman standing in the server room doorway. She was small, maybe 20, with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. Her clothes were expensive but ill-fitting, as if they belonged to someone else. "I'm sorry," she said in accented English. "I was looking for bathroom." Eastern European, just as Albert had described. One of McCarty's girls, probably kept in the building under some pretense of employment or training. Saul looked at her face, pretty but hollow, like a flower that had been picked too early and was slowly dying. "Bathroom's upstairs," he said gently. "Near the lobby." She nodded but didn't move. "You are, repairman?" "Plumber. Fixing the water pressure." "Water pressure." She repeated the words carefully, as if memorizing them. "This is good job?" "Honest job." The question hit Saul like a physical blow. Here was a girl who'd probably been promised honest work, legitimate employment, a chance at a better life. Instead, she'd found Charles McCarty and whatever hell he'd created for her. "Yes," Saul said quietly. "It's honest work." She smiled then, a fragile expression that transformed her face completely. I think honest work is a very good thing." Footsteps in the hallway made her stiffen with fear. She glanced toward the sound, then back at Saul. "I must go. Thank you for fixing water pressure." She was gone before Saul could respond, but her words echoed in the server room long after her footsteps faded. Honest work. A very good thing. Saul finished installing Dick's equipment and returned to his plumbing repairs with renewed focus. The pressure problem will be fixed, just as promised. But Charles McCarty's real problems were just beginning. Chapter 7. The Leak. The call came at 2 a.m., waking Saul from the first deep sleep he'd managed since leaving home. Dick's voice was tight with excitement and barely controlled rage. "We've got him." The monitoring equipment captured everything: financial records, shipping manifests, communications with his overseas contacts. "It's all there, Wilk. Every dirty detail of what that bastard's been doing." Saul sat up in the motel bed, instantly alert. "How bad?" "Worse than we thought. 43 girls in the last 2 years, most of them between 16 and 20. He's got a whole network: recruitment in Eastern Europe, transport through Canada, distribution to clients across the Eastern Seaboard. The warehouse we photographed? It's a processing center. They bring the girls there, break them down, train them, then ship them out to whoever's willing to pay." The young woman's face flashed through Saul's mind. Her careful English, her hollow eyes, her fragile smile when she'd talked about honest work. "Where are they now?" "That's the thing. McCarty's planning a major shipment this weekend. The intercepted communications mention clearing inventory before a new group arrives. We're talking about at least 15 girls who are about to disappear into the system permanently." Saul was already reaching for his clothes. "What's the plan? Officially, we turn everything over to the FBI and hope they can build a case before McCarty moves the girls. Unofficially, well, you didn't hear this from me, but Dick's been in touch with some people who take a more direct approach to problems like this." "What kind of direct approach?" "The kind that involves tactical teams and explosive entries in McCarty's operation getting shut down tonight, evidence or no evidence. The kind that might result in some unfortunate accidents for anyone who gets in the way." Saul understood. It was a gray world operation, the kind of justice that happened in the shadows when the official system moved too slowly. Timeline: 0:30. Dick's team hits the warehouse while McCarty's at the Crown Plaza for his usual Thursday night dinner with your wife. They extract the girls and plan enough evidence to guarantee McCarty gets charged even if he survives the encounter. And if he doesn't survive? Albert's laugh was cold. Then a lot of young women get to go home to their families instead of disappearing forever. Sometimes the math is that simple. Saul thought about Jill in her new dress, laughing at McCarty's jokes while 15 girls waited in a warehouse to be shipped like cargo. "Where do you need me?" "Crown Plaza. Dick's team needs someone inside to make sure McCarty stays put until they're finished at the warehouse. Someone who can get close without raising suspicions. The jealous husband routine." "Exactly. Show up, make a scene, keep McCarty busy dealing with domestic drama while the real work gets done. Can you handle seeing your wife with him?" Saul thought about the girl in the server room, about her careful words and frightened eyes. "I can handle it." "Good. And Wilk, when this is over, McCarty's going to be finished. His money, his reputation, his freedom, all gone. Your wife's going to find out exactly what kind of man she chose over you. She made her choice." "That she did. See you on the other side." The line went dead, leaving Saul alone in the motel room with his thoughts and the weight of what was coming. He dressed carefully: jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt that would mark him as the blue-collar husband Jill had found so embarrassing. In the mirror, he looked exactly like what McCarty would expect. A working man pushed too far, angry and unpredictable but ultimately harmless. Charles McCarty had built his fortune on understanding people, on recognizing weaknesses and exploiting them. Tonight, he would discover that some weaknesses were carefully constructed illusions, and some ordinary men carried extraordinary darkness. The Crown Plaza was about to host its last dinner party. Chapter 8: The Confrontation. The Crown Plaza's restaurant hummed with sophisticated conversation and the gentle clink of expensive crystal. Saul stood in the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the warm lighting while he located his targets. The hostess approached with the kind of polite smile reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" "I'm looking for my wife." He spotted them at a corner table, Jill radiant in a black dress he'd never seen, McCarty leaning across the table with predatory intimacy. They were sharing dessert and what looked like their third bottle of wine, completely absorbed in each other. "Sir, if you don't have a reservation." "There she is." Saul walked through the restaurant like a man in a dream, dimly aware of conversations faltering as diners recognized the menace in his approach. Jill saw him first, her face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and finally anger. "What the hell are you doing here, Saul?" Charles McCarty looked up with the mild annoyance of a man accustomed to having his evenings proceed without interruption. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than Saul made in a month, and his eyes held the flat calculation of someone who viewed other people as assets to be managed. "You must be the husband," McCarty said, his voice carrying the slight accent of old money and private schools. "Charles McCarty. Pleasure to meet you." He didn't offer to shake hands. "Charles has been telling me about his expansion plans," Jill said, her voice pitched loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "The new hotel in Miami, the resort development in Costa Rica. Real vision, unlike some people who are content fixing other people's toilets." Saul pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, noting how McCarty's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. Probably carrying, probably licensed, definitely inexperienced. "Costa Rica? That's interesting. I hear the construction industry down there has some unique labor practices." McCarty's eyes sharpened slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying. Just making conversation. I meet a lot of contractors in my line of work. You'd be surprised what people talk about when they think nobody important is listening." "Saul, stop it," Jill hissed. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Am I? Or am I just trying to understand what my wife finds so attractive about the hotel business?" Saul's phone buzzed once in his pocket. Dick's signal that the warehouse operation was beginning. Must be fascinating work, managing all those different accommodations. McCarty set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "Mr. Wilkerson, I think perhaps you've had too much to drink." "Haven't had a drop. But you're right, I probably should go." "Jill, when you're done here, we need to talk. About Melissa's college fund, about the house, about what's going to happen next." "There's nothing to discuss," Jill said. "I've already contacted a lawyer." "Have you? That's good. You'll want proper representation." Saul stood, noting how McCarty's eyes tracked his movements. "Charles, it's been educational. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, and Charles, you might want to check on your warehouse operation. I heard there might be some structural problems developing." The words hit McCarty like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed with anger and sudden understanding. "What did you just say?" But Saul was already walking away, moving through the restaurant with the unhurried pace of a man who had accomplished exactly what he'd come to do. Behind him, he heard McCarty's chair scrape against the floor, heard Jill's confused questions, heard the beginning of a conversation that would shatter both their worlds. His phone buzzed again, 2 short pulses. Dick's team had found the girls. By the time Charles McCarty reached the warehouse, it would be empty except for enough evidence to guarantee he'd spend the rest of his life in federal prison. By the time Jill understood what kind of man she'd chosen, she'd be facing her own legal problems as an accessory after the fact. Saul walked out into the night air, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. Honest work, the girl had said. A very good thing. Some kinds of work were more honest than others. Chapter 9. The Final Fix. 3 months later, Saul sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, reading about Charles McCarty's sentencing on his tablet. 25 to life in federal prison. No possibility of parole. The news article included a photograph of McCarty in an orange jumpsuit, his silver hair unkempt, his face gaunt with the reality of what his life had become. The warehouse raid had been devastating in its thoroughness. 15 girls rescued, enough evidence to implicate a network spanning 3 countries, and financial records that had led to dozens of arrests. McCarty's empire had collapsed in a single night, taking down clients, partners, and enablers across the eastern seaboard. Jill had been arrested 2 weeks later when investigators discovered she'd been laundering money through the hospital's charitable foundation. Small amounts over several months, but enough to qualify as accessory to trafficking. Her nursing license was revoked, her assets frozen, her respectable life reduced to legal fees and plea negotiations. The house on Maple Street had been seized as part of the federal investigation. Melissa was living with Jill's sister in Ohio, her college fund gone, her social media profile scrubbed of any reference to her father the plumber or her mother's glamorous new boyfriend. Saul's phone rang, interrupting his reading. Albert's number. How you doing, Wilk? Can't complain. You. Business is good. That situation in Portland work out for you. Saul looked around the coffee shop, at the faces of people who had no idea who he was or what he'd done. His new identity was solid. Papers that would withstand any scrutiny, a background that painted him as a retired plumber who'd moved west for his health. It worked out fine. Quiet place. Good people. Glad to hear it. Listen, Dick's got another situation developing. Similar profile to McCarty, but bigger. International scope. Could use someone with your particular skills if you're interested. Saul thought about the girl in the server room, about her frightened eyes and careful words. Somewhere in the world, there were other girls, other Charles McCartys, other systems that turned human beings into commodities. What's the timeline? Next month. Dick's setting up the surveillance now, but he'll need someone on the ground who can get close to the target. Someone who understands that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Send me the details. Already on its way. And Wilk, that thing with your wife and daughter, any regrets? Saul closed the tablet, erasing McCarty's face from the screen. They made their choices. I made mine. Good man. Talk soon. The coffee shop was filling with the afternoon crowd. Students from the local college, office workers grabbing their caffeine fix, ordinary people living ordinary lives. None of them would ever know that the quiet man in the corner booth had once been a husband and father, or that he'd walked away from everything he'd built to ensure that 15 girls could go home to their families. Saul finished his coffee and stepped out into the Portland afternoon. Somewhere across the country, Jill was probably sitting in a jail cell, finally understanding the true cost of trading up. Somewhere in Ohio, Melissa was learning that choices had consequences, that cruelty left scars, that not all fathers were as forgiving as the one she'd humiliated on his birthday. But those were old problems, old pain. Saul Wilkerson had work to do. The plumber's last fix had been perfect. No leaks, no pressure loss, no trace of the man who'd made the repair. And like all his best work, it would last forever. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.